Designed in the early 1600s by Charles de Lorme, personal physician to several French royals, the now iconic plague doctor costume was not some folkloric invention. It was practical, at least as practical as 17th century medicine could be. The wax cloak was meant to protect the body from miasma, the invisible poisonous vapors believed to cause disease. Leather gloves kept the hands clean. The long cane was used to poke at patients or examine corpses from a safe distance, and the grotesque mask held a glass eyepiece and a beak filled with aromatic herbs like lavender, rosemary, and camphor. You might wonder, why a beak? At the time, scent was thought to purify the air. So, the beak acted as a primitive gas mask, stuffed with ingredients meant to cleanse the miasma before it reached the lungs. But behind the uniform, the truth was far more disorganized. Plague doctors were often not the best and brightest. In fact, many were low-level physicians, unemployed graduates, or even barber surgeons and opportunists willing to risk exposure for a paycheck. Cities would hire plague doctors in desperation, offering salaries far higher than average. A contract might include housing, hazard pay, and occasionally permission to perform autopsies, a rare and valuable opportunity at the time. But there was a catch. Doctors were quarantined with their patients, often trapped in infected zones. You might expect them to be heroes, but some were charlatans, or worse. Most plague doctors didn't actually treat patients. Instead, they documented deaths, performed rudimentary physical inspections, and reported data to local officials. Some helped quarantine houses, delivered death certificates, or simply stood guard outside homes marked with a red cross. Others turned to quack remedies, powdered toad, crushed emerald, or warm vinegar rubs. Their medical knowledge was rooted in Galenic theory, which viewed illness as an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatment was guesswork. Bleeding, purging, or poultices, many of which only worsened the patient's condition. Doctors rarely touched their patients with bare hands. They wielded their canes like modern surgeons use forceps, probing buboes, lifting bed linens, or flipping bodies to check for plague signs. Imagine being one of them, trapped inside a sealed-off ward, listening to the coughing, the crying, the scratching at doors. No, wonder some never returned to the world outside. Many plague doctors were bound by bizarre contracts. For instance, in Turin, plague doctors had to swear to stay within city walls, even if conditions deteriorated. In Marseille, they were required to make daily body counts. In Venice, doctors were sometimes accompanied by guards to prevent escape. Some were allowed to write wills on behalf of the dying. Others were tasked with ensuring bodies were properly buried. Often, their notebooks became the only surviving records of entire neighborhoods. There were rarely more than a few plague doctors in the city at any one time. They couldn't go home. They often lived in isolation, housed near cemeteries, hospitals, or pest houses. Food was passed through slats. Letters were fumigated. Conversations occurred through closed doors. This strange, self-imposed exile could last months or years. Some doctors went mad. Others disappeared. And some profited. In the absence of curers, plague doctors often became enforcers. They collaborated with local officials to seal houses, post red crosses on doors, and guard infected streets. The boundary between healer and jailer blurred. And the beak, that absurdly long beak, came to symbolize not just a flawed understanding of disease, but the fear of the other. The spectacle of it frightened people more than it reassured them. To the poor, plague doctors were signs of doom. To the rich, they were last resorts. But to themselves, perhaps, they were merely men in masks, trapped by history, forced to watch a city crumble from behind glass lenses and herbal-scented silence. What did it feel like to live every day behind a mask, knowing that death was closer than healing, and that your only job was to watch? The first section showed you what the plague doctor looked like and how he worked. But now, let's move closer, beneath the robe, inside the mask, and into the personal corners of these forgotten men. These doctors were not symbols. They were real, breathing people with families, ambitions, fears, and secrets. This section focuses on the human side of plague doctors, where they came from, what they endured, and how they survived or didn't. It's about why they took the job, what they lost, and how history remembers or forgets them. There was no formal university course in plague doctoring. Instead, these men often arrived by desperation or coincidence. Some were recent medical graduates who couldn't find steady work in towns flooded with underemployed physicians. Others were foreigners brought in by cities to avoid infecting their local professionals. A few were non-medical, trained in rudimentary anatomy or surgery, willing to assume the role because no one else would. Imagine this. You're a 27-year-old Italian barber surgeon. You've stitched wounds, drained abscesses, and shaved beards. One day, a town official offers you a high-paying contract, double your usual income. All you have to do is live inside the city during an outbreak. Your wife begs you not to go. Your mother prays, but you sign the papers. Because if not you, then who? Once accepted into the position, you were marked. Even before stepping inside the city walls, your community often rejected you. Friends distanced themselves. Families panicked. Letters from plague doctors during the 17th century revealed deep loneliness. My son has refused to see me. I can send him no coin, for my purse is sealed in quarantine. God forgive me for leaving. Letter from Dr. Matteo Colito, 1631. There are accounts of plague doctors being denied burial in family plots. Others were not allowed to re-enter their towns, even after years of faithful service. The cloak of death they wore extended into their private lives, long after the plague had burned out. Let's talk about the interior of the famous mask. We imagine the herbs inside the beak were fragrant, but after days or weeks of reuse, the scent soured. Doctors would often reuse masks throughout entire epidemics, and while they refilled the herbs, the beak became a fetid trap of rot and sweat. The beak also caused the voice to sound distant and hollow. Patients described plague doctors as sounding like ghosts in church crypts. The interior was hot, humid, and dark, with only narrow glass eye holes and thick cloth behind them. Vision was reduced. The outer air may have smelled of rot, but inside the mask, one carried your own decay. And yet you wore it, because to remove the mask was to risk your life. One of the cruelest aspects of the plague doctor's life was emotional neutrality. You were forbidden from becoming close to your patients, not just to protect your health, but to preserve professional distance in a world of unstoppable death. But not all could manage this. In a letter discovered in Krakow from 1611, a doctor named Benedict Ostrowski wrote, "She asked me to hold her hand. I did. Her skin was cold, like bread left on stone. 2 days later, she was buried in lime." Such moments were rare. Most doctors avoided all contact, both out of fear and necessity. But some, perhaps the ones who cracked under silence, couldn't help but touch. One overlooked task of plague doctors was drafting or witnessing last wills and testaments. Because priests and notaries often refused to enter infected homes, doctors had to become scribes of the dying. This placed them in a strange position. They were silent witnesses to emotional breakdowns, final confessions, and family rifts. A typical one might begin, "I, Giovanni di Russo, being a mind though weakened by pestilence, do leave my cart and silver ring to my youngest son." Some wills included bizarre requests: to be buried with garlic cloves, to have one's home burned entirely, to have pets set free rather than killed. Each request, though strange, was a form of control in a world that had none. And the doctors, quietly sweating in their wax robes, recorded them all. In wealthier cities, plague doctors charged more for premium services. Even in crisis, they could be bribed to deliver letters across quarantine lines, give a clean bill of health in exchange for gold, smuggle loved ones out of infected zones. These transactions, while ethically gray, were commonplace, but not all were corrupt. Some rejected payment altogether, choosing to work out of spiritual duty, especially in Spain and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. These doctors saw themselves as servants of God, sent to suffer with the people. And what happened when plague doctors themselves became infected? There were no special wards for them. Some cities allowed doctors to write their own preemptive wills, detailing who would replace them. Others simply burned the garments, buried the body, and hired a replacement within days. One record from Prague, 1680, Lists. Dr. Ludwig Geisler. Deceased. Replaced by Jacob Zoll. No surviving belongings. The world moved on. The beak passed from one phase to the next. When the epidemic ended, many plague doctors faced lifelong stigma. Some were celebrated briefly, then forgotten. Others tried to return to normal practice, but were shunned by patients. The black robe, once a mark of bravery, became a symbol of fear. It appeared in stage plays as a villain's costume. It became associated with death, corruption, and fear. And eventually, it became a Halloween costume, a cartoonish echo of a long-dead job. But behind that echo were men who stood alone in the darkest of hours, with nothing but bitter herbs and cloth between them and the plague. What price did they truly pay, not just in coin or health, but in being forgotten? When the robe came off and the mask was stored away, what identity remained? So far, we've walked the plague doctor through the filthy alleys of infected cities, behind the fog lenses of the beak mask, and into the solitude of their isolated lives. Now, in this final section, we reflect on what happened after the mask was removed, not just for the doctors themselves, but for the world that outlived them. This is not a story about medicine succeeding. It's a story about what we remember, what we forget, and why the beak still haunts our imagination centuries later. As the 18th century crept in, Europe began to shift from superstition to science. Theories of humors began to lose credibility. Advances in anatomy, microscopy, and public health emerged. Slowly, painfully, we realized the plague was not caused by bad air, but by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas on rats. By the time the 1800s arrived, the plague doctor had become obsolete. The outfit, once cutting-edge protection, was a joke to newer physicians. They wore linen coats, used soap and alcohol, and eventually embraced germ theory. But the bird mask remained, not in hospitals, but in art, fear, and memory. The costume migrated to masquerade balls, satirical plays, and puppet shows. It transformed from healer to harbinger, from a real person to a ghostly archetype of death. Here's a secret. Many plague doctors were never real doctors. City councils often hired outsiders for plague duty, not to treat patients, but to maintain quarantine zones, count the dead, and enforce laws. Some were military men, others were failed scholars, and a few were even criminals, given a chance at redemption. The robe was a disguise, a social costume. It gave authority to men with none, and fearsome legitimacy to those with questionable motives. This ambiguity is part why the image survives. It's not a symbol of medicine. It's a symbol of uncertainty. The mask says, "I am here to help you," but hides the face so thoroughly that you don't know if you believe it. Most plague doctors are anonymous. Their names never made it into textbooks. Their stories lived in local archives, dusty town logs, and scribbled marginalia. But a few have resurfaced. Dr. Alexander Petit of Toulouse kept the most detailed account of the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720. His meticulous diaries are one of the few reliable records we have. Dr. George Ray in Edinburgh charged enormous fees during the 1645 outbreak, only to die before collecting most of them. Matteo Fuoco, a minor doctor from Naples, sketched his own patients' deaths obsessively in the margins of his casebooks. Each entry ended with the same word, perso, lost. These men weren't saviors. They were scribes of suffering, tasked with observing humanity's unraveling without flinching. Most of them did just that. In the modern age, the plague doctors returned, not to heal, but to haunt. In Venetian Carnival, the Medico della Peste mask is now worn as part of historical reenactments. The real suffering behind it, lost in the festivities. In video games and horror films, the beak appears as a villain or an agent of death. It evokes mystery, morbidity, and silence. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the plague doctor saw a resurgence on social media, used in memes and protest art. Some wore the costume to remind others of past pandemics. Others used it for satire. Each time the image is revived, it says more about our fears than about their reality. And still, the actual men who wore the beak remain unnamed. There are many terrifying things in history: guillotines, gallows, burning stakes. But the plague doctor endures because he was not an executioner. He came, allegedly, to save you. But when you saw him, it meant you or your neighbor or your mother was already beyond help. The beak didn't bring relief. It brought finality. And perhaps that's why it's remembered. The horror of medicine that couldn't do anything. A symbol of human limits. A face we created to confront the unknowable. They didn't leave breakthroughs. No miracle cures. No revolutionary theories. What they left were careful records. Dates, names, symptoms, household inventories, the number of corpses in a cart. They gave us numbers, cold, lifeless numbers, but those numbers became history. Without them, we wouldn't know how deeply the plague reached into European life. And so the doctors became historians by accident, not of triumph, but of loss. If you look for statues of plague doctors, you'll find almost none. If you look for paintings, you'll find caricatures, not portraits. If you look for graves, they're anonymous. And yet, the world has not forgotten the beak. In a way, these men have been remembered for the wrong reasons. For their costume, not their courage. For the absurdity of their appearance, not the endurance of their silence. They weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were people. Caught between science and fear, obligation and survival, obscurity and legend. Perhaps the greatest horror of the plague doctor is not his mask, but the echoing silence behind it. In a world gripped by death, he said little, did less, and stayed longer than most would dare. So now that you know his secrets, do you still see him as absurd? Or do you see him as something far more unsettling? In the shimmering light of the Venetian lagoon, gondolas glide quietly past decaying stone, their wakes leaving brief scars across green water. Tourists visit the majestic palazzos of the main city, but few notice the low, isolated islands beyond the Grand Canal. These islands, Lazaretto Vecchio, Lazaretto Nuovo, and others, once played host to an experiment so ambitious, so quietly tragic, and so medically primitive that it helped define how the world still handles disease today. Venice, the powerful maritime republic, built a system of quarantine centuries before germ theory. And they tested it not in theory, but on real people, on islands of exile just beyond view. This is the story of those islands, and the people who disappeared into them. The very word quarantine is Venetian in origin. In 1377, as the Black Death tore across Europe, the nearby city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, began requiring incoming ships to wait offshore for a period of 30 days, called a Trentino. This was later extended to 40 days, Quaranta Giorni, hence Quarantina. Venice adopted and formalized the practice around 1403. But Venice did not just ask ships to wait at sea. They went further. They built entire quarantine stations on islands. One of the first and most infamous was Lazaretto Vecchio, a small island near the Lido, converted into a plague isolation facility. In later years, Lazaretto Nuovo followed. These were not hospitals. They were containment zones. And once you were sent there, your life changed, if it continued at all. Venice was not just a city. It was a trade empire. Ships from Constantinople, Alexandria, Tunis, and Marseilles arrived daily, carrying everything from spices to silk, and with them, disease. But unlike inland cities, Venice could control its entry points. Officials, called health magistrates, monitored the harbors. Each ship's captain was required to present a bill of health from their port of departure. If there were reports of sickness aboard, or even rumors, the ship was directed not to port, but to one of the islands. The cargo was fumigated. The crew was isolated. The passengers were watched. If anyone sneezed, coughed, or sweated too much, they were removed and taken deeper into the quarantine station. If you survived 40 days, you could enter the city. If you didn't, you never left the island at all. Lazaretto Vecchio, Old Lazarus Island, became Venice's first official plague quarantine station. Once a leper hospital, it was repurposed in the early 15th century to house suspected plague cases. The island was small, bleak, and isolated. There were no families, no trade, no churches ringing in the distance. Doctors came and went. Guards watched the perimeter. Smoke constantly rose from burning textiles and cargo. Patients were sorted. Those showing symptoms were kept in one area, those suspected of exposure in another. You were allowed a single chest of belongings, subject to burning or fumigation. Bedding was often destroyed. Letters were pierced with vinegar-soaked needles before being handed over. Food was passed through slots. Conversations were shouted across courtyards. And time passed slowly. Venice's quarantine islands were marvels of early public health bureaucracy. There were registries of every individual, names, origin ports, symptoms, duration of stay. Large ledgers tracked who had touched what, from crates of fabric to copper coins. If a merchant's goods were exposed, they were stored in fumigation chambers for 40 days, surrounded by sulfur or vinegar smoke. Meanwhile, human passengers underwent surveillance. They were visited daily by staff, who wore minimal protection, often just linen veils or sprigs of herbs. If they worsened, they were transferred to the dying hall, and if they died, they were buried, often hastily, often in mass graves. Mass graves on Lazaretto Vecchio were shallow and numerous. Bodies were wrapped in linen, sometimes doused in lime, and laid in communal pits. Wood was scarce. Individual coffins were rare. Excavations in the early 2000s uncovered over 1,500 skeletons, many showing signs of plague. Jaw abscesses, swollen joints, scorched bone. Few of these bodies were ever named. Records were imprecise, lost, or ignored. These were people whose lives ended in limbo, not citizens, not patients, not criminals. Simply suspected, and in death, they received neither ceremony nor stone, just earth and silence. One of the darkest realities of the quarantine islands is this. You didn't have to be sick to be sent there. Being suspected was enough. If you were on a ship with one sick passenger, if you carried goods from a blacklisted port, if your health looked frail to the harbor master, even if you were wealthy, even if you were clergy, even if you were a physician, you could be quarantined. Entire crews, noble families, and traveling scholars were held for weeks. Some never showed symptoms. Some did. Many left traumatized. The line between caution and imprisonment was thin. Venice's quarantine model spread across Europe. Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona, and London adopted their own versions. Quarantine stations, called lazarettos, appeared in harbors across the Mediterranean. Entire islands were designated as infected zones. The model persisted into the 18th and 19th centuries. Even as medical science advanced, the idea of removing the potentially sick from society remained central. In many ways, it still is. Every modern quarantine policy, from SARS to Ebola to COVID-19, traces its roots back to Venice's lagoon. Was Venice wise or cruel? Did the quarantine islands save the city, or simply shift the suffering elsewhere? In the previous section, you walked through the eerie calm of Lazaretto Vecchio, through its smoke-filled fumigation chambers, past shallow graves, and among people trapped not by illness, but by suspicion. Now, we look behind the curtain of bureaucracy at how this system functioned, who enforced it, and why so many people quietly accepted it. This is a story of paperwork, privilege, and punishment, of how Venice tried to control chaos through record-keeping, and how the quarantine system, meant to protect, became a silent tool of power. Centuries before airports and vaccines, Venice created something surprisingly modern, the health passport. These documents, called fedi di sanità, were certificates issued to ships, individuals, or cargo confirming their clean bill of health. Without one, you couldn't enter the city. They stated the port of origin, any stops along the route, whether sickness was present at those stops, if the ship had been quarantined, the condition of the crew and cargo. Sometimes these were forged. Sometimes they were outdated. Sometimes they were useless against fear. But they were required. Even locals needed permits to leave or return to the city. Traders kept them folded in wax leather. Pilgrims pinned them to their tunics. Without the right stamp or signature, you were as dangerous as the plague itself. At the heart of the system was a uniquely Venetian invention, the Magistrato alla Sanità, the Office of Health. Founded in the 15th century, this office oversaw every aspect of disease control. It was composed of 3 appointed noblemen and supported by secretaries, inspectors, guards, and physicians. They did not wait for outbreaks to act. Instead, they monitored foreign correspondence for reports of sickness, maintained a list of suspicious ports, a kind of 15th century watch list, enforced strict rules on sanitation, burials, and public gatherings, could override individual rights for the public good. They kept meticulous records, many of which survive to this day. In old Italian script, you can read the decisions. This day, October 4th, 1526, a galley from Aleppo shall be directed to Lazaretto Nuovo for a period of 40 days. Its cotton cargo to be fumigated. No contact with the mainland is permitted. The documents are dry. But between the lines, you find the invisible fear that drove the city. The system didn't rely on goodwill alone. It was enforced through networks of surveillance. Harbor inspectors monitored arriving vessels. City guards checked bills of health at every gate. Watchmen stood on rooftops, looking for funeral processions or illicit gatherings. Paid informants, often servants, porters, or clerks, reported neighbors with symptoms. The penalties were harsh. Fines for breaking quarantine. Public flogging for smuggling letters or goods. Exile for bribing officials. In some cases, execution for knowingly exposing others. People cooperated not just from fear of disease, but fear of punishment. And the system's strength lay not in walls or guards, but in its paper trail. If you had the wrong stamp, or no signature at all, you were invisible to mercy. Of course, no system survives without cracks. Wealthy merchants often found ways to circumvent isolation. A donation to a local church, a gift of silk to a magistrate's wife, or a forged fee di sanita could mean early release. Some cargo was too valuable to wait 40 days. Officials might declare it low risk after just 10, or they might look the other way entirely. There are records of wines moved early due to sacramental necessity. High-born travelers assigned private quarantine chambers with servants. Letters hand-delivered to the Doge's palace by mass messengers, bypassing all fumigation. This dual system, one for the poor, one for the privileged, mirrored the disease itself. Merciless of many, but always sparing a few. Inside the quarantine islands, objects were treated with ritualistic care. Textiles, wool, silk, cotton, were unrolled and hung over long lines in open-air halls. Beneath them, pans of burning vinegar, sulfur, or pitch released acrid fumes intended to kill pestilential vapors. Books were left open on wooden racks. Coins were placed in vinegar baths. Letters were pricked with needles and passed through smoke boxes. This was not symbolic. Venetians believed disease could cling to cloth, leather, even paper. In fact, they weren't wrong, though they didn't know about bacteria. Sometimes, entire shipments were declared irredeemable and burned. And once burned, they were erased, not just physically, but economically. For merchants, a quarantine could mean ruin. The costs weren't always visible. Some passengers died during their quarantine, not from plague, but from neglect, malnutrition, or exposure. Others grew sick from smoke inhalation, sleeping on stone floors near open fumigation fires. Mental health was a silent casualty. Letters from quarantined travelers reveal paranoia, guilt, and disorientation. They say the island is safe, but I smell only death. I hear no birds. My hands itch from the smoke. I cannot dream without fire. Anonymous letter, Lazaretto Nuovo, 1603. For those wrongly imprisoned or held beyond necessity, the islands became psychological prisons. They began to see themselves not as potential carriers, but as sacrifices. Despite its sophistication, Venice's system didn't always work. The Great Plague of 1575 to 77 killed 50,000 people in Venice, nearly a third of its population. In 1630 to 31, another wave swept through the city. Churches were converted into temporary morgues. Gondolas carried bodies instead of passengers. The canal water turned stagnant with decay. The quarantine system wasn't abandoned. It was intensified. More guards, longer inspections, stricter penalties. But it was clear no system could stop everything. The disease adapted. Human nature found loopholes. And Venice, for all its planning, still wept in silence. Was the island prison a necessary sacrifice? Or did it simply delay the inevitable. You have drifted past Lazaretto Vecchio. You've smelled the vinegar and sulfur, felt the sting of ash-laden air, and heard the scratch of pen against parchment in dusty ledgers. Now, in this final section, we step back and look at the legacy of Venice's quarantine system. What did the islands leave behind? And how do they echo in the modern world? Long after the boats have stopped arriving, this is a story of what remains. The bones, the silence, the procedures still used today, and the strange comfort of believing in borders that disease cannot cross. In the early 2000s, archaeologists from the University of Venice and other international teams began careful excavation of Lazaretto Vecchio. What they found was grim, but not surprising. Over 1,500 skeletons, many buried in shallow, overlapping trenches. Some bodies were wrapped in fragments of linen or coarse wool. Bones showed signs of hurried handling, broken ribs, twisted limbs. Nearby were iron rings, likely used to carry stretchers or restrain the terminally ill. And beneath a crumbling wall, they discovered a mass grave, several dozen bodies, layered like pages, undisturbed for centuries. No names, no plaques, just silence and the distant splash of passing waves. The island is not open to the public. Not yet, but the findings are clear. Venice did not forget to bury the dead. It forgot to remember them. Though the islands faded from use, their procedures lived on. Centuries later, during the cholera epidemics of the 19th century, European ports adopted similar protocols. Isolation of ships, fumigation of mail and cargo, inspections before disembarkation, health documentation required for entry. In the early 20th century, quarantine stations appeared in New York, Ellis Island, Sydney, North Head Quarantine Station, and San Francisco, Angel Island, all modeled in part on the Venetian ideal. Even the World Health Organization's International Health Regulations, established in 1969 and revised in 2005, carry the ghost of Venice's watchfulness, suspicion, and enforced stillness. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Venetian model reemerged, without most people realizing it. Airports screened passengers for fevers. Cruise ships were denied port entry. Cities set up isolation facilities in hotels. Red zones sealed off neighborhoods. Governments issued modern versions of the Feed di Sanita, QR codes, vaccine cards, health declarations. And again, as before, the system relied on paperwork, surveillance, public trust, and fear. There were debates about freedom, privacy, and fairness. But beneath those arguments was a centuries-old truth. Quarantine is not just a medical act. It's a moral and political one. Just like in Venice, in the eyes of health officials, quarantine is a necessary sacrifice. But for those inside its grasp, it is something else entirely. The legacy of the Venetian quarantine islands is not one of triumph. It is one of trade-offs. Stability over clarity. Control over compassion. Safety over justice. Even when the system worked, it relied on fear. It divided people into clean and unclean, safe and suspicious. It reduced human lives to waiting periods and inspection logs. And it always carried the unspoken question, how much must we isolate others to protect ourselves? Today, the quarantine islands of Venice are mostly abandoned. Lazaretto Vecchio is overgrown, its courtyards cracked and dusty. Lazaretto Nuovo is occasionally visited by archaeologists and historians. Some islands are inaccessible, overrun by weeds, ruins, or nesting birds. But stand on the northern tip of Venice and look east across the water, and you'll see them. Quiet, empty, watching. And if you listen, you may hear something beneath the wind. Not voices, not coughing, just a faint shuffle of a boot on stone and the flutter of a parchment bill of health. The Venetian quarantine islands were not grand failures, nor were they great successes. They were something more complicated. A rehearsal for every epidemic that came after, played out on a small stage of stone, smoke, and sea. Their legacy is not in cures. It is in the questions they force us to ask, questions we are still answering centuries later. Who is worthy of freedom during a plague? What price is acceptable to stop contagion? And can isolation ever truly be humane? Perhaps the quarantine islands were not built to cure the sick. Perhaps they were built to teach the living. When we seal the sick away, who are we protecting more, them or ourselves? And when the illness is gone, what do we do with the walls we built? Imagine waking up in the year 1348. Your armpit is sore. A lump has formed beneath your jaw. You feel weak, nauseated. Maybe it's just fatigue, or maybe it's a death sentence. You don't know, and neither does anyone around you. Because in this world, illness doesn't come with names, only with signs. Swelling, stench, spots, weakness. This is a story about the misdiagnosed, the wrongly exiled, and the long overlap between plague, leprosy, syphilis, and other so-called black marks. When people were judged not by what they had, but by how they looked, before germ theory, before microscopes, even before formal anatomy, disease was not a scientific concept. It was a spiritual, moral, and visual one. You were considered sick if your skin looked wrong, your breath smelled foul, your body swelled in unnatural places, you moved differently than others. This meant that vastly different diseases, plague, leprosy, syphilis, tuberculosis, scrofula, were often grouped together. People didn't think of them as separate illnesses. They were simply manifestations of corruption, spiritual, physical, or both. If you had the wrong kind of mark, the consequences could be swift and permanent. The most iconic sign of the Black Death was the bubo, a swollen lymph node, often in the armpit or groin, hot and excruciating to the touch. But here's the problem. Buboes aren't unique to plague. They can appear in tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, syphilis, especially in its early stages, leprosy in some advanced cases, even in common bacterial infections of wounds or skin. So when a person showed up with a bubo, it was impossible to tell, was this person contagious with the plague or simply infected from a minor wound? Medieval medicine didn't distinguish. The presence of a swelling was enough. You were often removed from town, marked with cloth or paint, sent to pest houses or lazarettos, or simply abandoned. The mark on your body became a mark on your social identity. Leprosy, today known as Hansen's disease, was feared in medieval Europe as a slow, decaying rot. But in truth, it is a chronic bacterial infection, often non-contagious, and very slow to progress. Still, if you had skin lesions, deformed fingers, a hoarse voice, loss of eyebrows, you were often declared a leper, whether or not you had the disease. People with eczema, psoriasis, severe acne, or fungal infections were misdiagnosed, exiled to leper colonies, and given no appeal. They were required to wear distinctive clothing, often gray or brown, ring bells or clappers to warn others, live outside city walls, often near graveyards or marshes. Their condition was not just seen as medical, it was moral. Leprosy was considered punishment for sin, lust, pride, or greed. The body was a message from God, and misreading that message destroyed lives. When syphilis began to spread across Europe in the late 15th century, likely introduced after the return of Columbus's sailors, its symptoms baffled physicians. The disease was called the French disease in Italy, the Spanish disease in France, the Christian disease in the Ottoman Empire. Its signs included painful sores, rash and lesions, neurological effects in late stages, swelling of lymph nodes. Once again, the overlap with plague and leprosy was striking. And once again, people were misclassified, especially the poor. Prisons, brothels, and military hospitals became quarantine sites for people with unknown illness. Some were treated with mercury ointments. Others were simply removed from public life. There was no distinction between contagion and judgment. Your diagnosis was often made by your social status as much as your symptoms. The tragedy of this confusion was not only the punishment of the sick, but of the healthy. Historical records show numerous cases of pregnant women with minor swelling being sent to plague islands, children with rashes being removed from schools and never returning, elderly people with arthritis mistaken for leprosy and abandoned. One letter from a priest in Avignon, 1421, reads, "A woman came to me with hands wrapped in linen. Her husband had accused her of leprosy. I saw no such signs. But fear is greater than proof. There were no appeals. Once you were marked, the door shut behind you. You might ask, why didn't they try harder to differentiate diseases? Because they didn't believe in disease the way we do. Illness was not a specific diagnosis. It was a state of imbalance or an external corruption. Whether it came from miasma, sin, bad water, or divine didn't matter. What mattered was avoiding it. And the easiest way to do that was to remove anyone who looked wrong. This system persisted for centuries. From ancient leper colonies in the Middle East, to plague boards in Venice, to lazarettos in 18th century Marseilles, the system of classifying disease by appearance alone ruined countless lives. And the worst part? We have no idea how many people were wrongly diagnosed. The records often state only spots appeared on the neck, swelling of the groin, skin turned dark, and then sent away. No further mention, no return, just disappearance. What if the mark on your body wasn't a symptom, but a misunderstanding? How many lives were erased not by illness, but by the fear of misreading the body? In the previous section, we saw how indistinct symptoms, swelling, rashes, skin lesions, led to countless misdiagnoses, often condemning healthy individuals to lives of exile. Now, we turn our gaze to the deeper implications of those judgments, how appearance became moral evidence, how authorities used sickness to enforce social boundaries, and how the fear of illness gave rise to a shadow caste system, one not based on truth, but on visible imperfection. This is a story of how flesh became stigma, and how, in the absence of knowledge, entire classes of people were defined not by who they were, but by what they looked like. In medieval and early modern Europe, the church dominated medical interpretation. Illness was rarely just seen as a physical problem. It was a spiritual consequence. This belief had ancient roots. From the biblical story of Job to Leviticus's commandments on skin diseases, religious texts often portrayed bodily affliction as a form of punishment or divine testing. Thus, a person with visible symptoms, no matter how minor, might be labeled a sinner, a heretic, a witch, or simply unclean, and once labeled, the response was rarely compassionate. If you were declared a leper, the process was ritualized. In many European cities, a leper's mass was held for the afflicted, not to heal them, but to symbolically declare their death to the community. It was a reverse funeral. The ceremony included a priest declaring the individual dead to the world, the person being given a leper's cloak, hood, and bell, a symbolic burial of their old clothes, instructions to never speak unless spoken to, and to walk against the wind so their breath would not spread contagion. In some cities, they were even required to dig their own grave in advance. Imagine, you are a young man with eczema or psoriasis or an infected wound, and one morning, after a neighbor reports your symptoms, you are put to death socially, not because you are dying, but because you look like someone who might. The fear of skin diseases created an underclass in Europe, people who were neither confirmed as ill nor accepted as well. This included the scabby poor, vagrants with visible sores or lesions, pockmarked survivors of smallpox, disabled soldiers mistaken for plague victims, women with visible birthmarks, moles, or discoloration, sometimes accused of being witches. For these individuals, appearance dictated access to employment, marriage, housing, religious rites, burial in consecrated ground. The result was a slow social death, where survival meant little if your skin told the wrong story. By the 17th century, European explorers and colonists began encountering unfamiliar populations in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They brought with them not just trade, but preconceived notions of health and appearance. Skin color, already a target of exoticism and prejudice, became intertwined with disease theory. Darker skin was often associated with rottenness, corruption, or moral impurity. In colonial medical texts, indigenous people were described as more susceptible to leprosy or naturally unclean. Scrofula, yaws, and leprosy were often misdiagnosed or invented to rationalize colonial control and segregation. Medical language became a justification for racial hierarchy. If your skin looked different, it was easier to frame you as dangerous, and thus the fear of infection merged with imperialism. With time, Certain diseases became more understood. But rather than welcoming the previously exiled back into society, many cities simply moved the goalposts. Even as treatments emerged, people with healed skin conditions remained stigmatized. Survivors of plague were seen as unclean for life. Recovered lepers were often denied property rights or communion. To be cured didn't mean you were forgiven. In London in the early 1700s, laws allowed recovered plague victims to return to work, but only if they wore a special badge indicating their status. This plague badge was intended to inform, but often provoked discrimination and abuse. Once marked, the stain never washed off. By the Renaissance period, quack doctors, traveling healers, and patent medicine sellers began to exploit the population's fear of visible illness. They offered snake oils for blotchy skin, mercury-based salves for buboes, magical amulets to prevent leprosy, spiritual confessions that could reverse the curse. People would pay anything to avoid being misread, but some unscrupulous doctors went further. They made false accusations to sell their cures. If a person showed a blemish, they might be told, "You are in the first stage of plague, but I can prevent it for a price." And so, misdiagnosis became not just tragedy, but business. By the 1800s, medical understanding had advanced dramatically. Microscopes revealed the true causes of disease. Germ theory replaced miasma, but the cultural memory of the black mark persisted. Even after leprosy was proven to be bacterial and treatable, patients were still locked away in colonies, especially in Hawaii, India, and Norway. Even after buboes were known to be caused by Yersinia pestis, survivors were still treated as cursed or dangerous. Fear outlived ignorance, and society's reflex to separate mark and exile based on appearance alone continued well beyond the age of science. Today, we can identify most diseases with blood tests, scans, and lab work, but there is still a trace of the old instinct. We flinch when we see rashes on others. We look twice at scars, at lesions, at faces shaped by illness. And sometimes, even now, people with chronic skin conditions suffer not from their symptoms, but from how others react to them. The legacy of the black mark remains, just more quietly. When truth is invisible and fear is visible, who gets to decide what illness looks like? How many lives have been rewritten by a simple, misunderstood blemish? You have now walked among those cast out for swollen glands, for blistered skin, or for misfortune of being born looking different. You've seen how fear of disease blurred the line between medical response and social exile. Now we reflect on what remains of those practices. How did these judgments shape the world we live in? And what happens when a body is no longer just flesh, but a message misread? This final section is not about disease itself, but about the system's rituals and beliefs that emerge in response. Systems that, in many ways, never fully disappeared. Let us begin with a word that should mean comfort. Hospital. The leprosaria, pest houses, lazarettos, and plague huts across Europe were called hospitals, but they rarely offered healing. They were containment centers. Facilities like St. Mary Magdalene Leper Hospital in York, L'Hôpital d'Incurables in Paris, Santa Maria della Pieta in Venice were places where people were not treated but held, often indefinitely, often with minimal care, often without consent. These institutions often doubled as asylums for the poor, holding places for the socially undesirable, moral correction centers for women accused of promiscuity or witchcraft. Once admitted, the goal was not wellness. It was removal from public view. Being sent to a leper colony or pest house was more than a medical decision. It was a severance from humanity. You lost your name, replaced by a number or nickname, your family ties, as visitors were discouraged or banned, your legal rights, including property and inheritance, your burial rights, often denied in consecrated ground. The physical isolation was only part of the suffering. The psychological impact of being seen as tainted, of knowing you could not return, was far greater. Letters from 17th century patients in French leper houses speak of profound despair. I no longer feel illness, only silence. My body is not what pains me. It is the forgetting. Some diseases were survivable. Some were misdiagnosed entirely. But the social punishment continued long after recovery. Former lepers were often required to live in mark houses. Survivors of the plague in London were banned from taverns or church choirs. Women with visible smallpox scars were declared unmarriageable, especially among the merchant class. In some towns, if you had ever been suspected of infection, you could be excluded from guilds, barred from voting, or denied entry into certain markets. The body remembered, but so did the community. In many regions, especially in Germany, Poland, and parts of Scandinavia, local ordinances codified visual diagnosis into law. For example, a person with blackened toes or persistent cough could be denied lodging. Beggars with open sores would be driven from the parish. Women with facial lesions were subject to moral inquiry, often tied to accusations of sexual impropriety. The laws were not consistent, nor were they based on medical logic. They were tools of control, used to protect towns not just from disease, but from disruption. People who didn't fit the physical ideal were considered potential sources of chaos. Occasionally, the misdiagnosed found themselves accused of something worse than disease. Sorcery. Black moles? A witch's mark. A natural skin tone? A sign of demonic possession. Rapid illness in a village? Someone must have cast a spell. Women, in particular, were vulnerable. In rural England and France, court records showed dozens of cases where women with eczema or facial cysts were accused of witchcraft. Sometimes their blemishes were cut open during interrogation, believed to be devil's teats. Few survived trial. None escaped stigma. It wasn't until the 19th century that visible symptoms were placed in context. Louis Pasteur's discovery of microorganisms, Robert Koch's identification of disease-specific bacteria, advances in pathology, showing that lesions and swellings would result, not the source, of disease. With these discoveries, the black mark began to fade, not from skin, but from meaning. People no longer needed to prove their health by appearance alone, but the cultural instinct to fear what we see remained stubborn. We no longer exile the visibly ill to pest houses, but consider the child with eczema mocked at school, the elderly woman with vitiligo avoided on the bus, the man with visible HIV-related lesions denied service. Even now, in an age of medical understanding, our first reaction is often not empathy, but revulsion. The black mark still exists, just less openly enforced. It has moved from law to habit, from ritual to reflex. It would be easy to forget these people. After all, their diagnoses were wrong, their records incomplete, their names misspelled. But the wrongly exiled did something remarkable. They made systems evolve. Their suffering pushed physicians to ask better questions, study harder, challenge dogma, separate symptoms from assumptions. They were cautionary tales, but also unwilling pioneers, sacrificed to ignorance, yet remembered in every improvement that followed. The black mark was never about illness alone. It was about judgment made visible, about the need to point, to label, to push away what makes us uncomfortable. And though we no longer burn rags soaked in vinegar or ring bells on the street, we still struggle with the same fear, that someone who looks different might be dangerous, and that, if we can see it, maybe we can stop it. But the body doesn't always tell the truth. And the greatest danger comes not from what we see, but from what we assume. If the black mark was never real to begin with, only a trick of vision and fear, then how many people have we condemned because we couldn't bear to look deeper? Imagine closing your window as the summer sun rises, pulling thick drapes over despite the sweltering heat. You light incense, burn herbs, and hang damp cloths in the corners of your room. You do all this not for comfort, but for survival. This is not superstition. This is science, as it was understood for centuries. This is a world of miasma theory. The belief that disease was carried not by people, germs, or objects, but by bad air. And for hundreds of years, this belief shaped cities, clothing, public health, and even architecture. To stay alive, one had to avoid the wind. From ancient Greece through the 19th century, miasma theory dominated medicine. Hippocrates and Galen believed that disease came from environmental imbalances, corrupted air, rising from rotting matter, sewage, swamps, and unclean places. This foul air, called miasma, was thought to seep into the body through the nose, mouth, or skin, especially at night or during warm weather. Key beliefs included: stagnant air equals dangerous. Strong odors equals a sign of danger. Sweet, perfumed air equals protection. Miasma wasn't a metaphor. It was considered a tangible, poisonous substance. And fresh air, especially at dawn or dusk, was often viewed as its delivery system. Daily life was dictated by air. Evening walks were discouraged. Windows were shuttered during plagues or heat waves. Hospitals were built with low, narrow ventilation slits instead of open breezeways. Children and the elderly were kept indoors, particularly on foggy or humid days. One popular 16th century Italian medical tract advised: close the shutters at sunset, for that is the hour of the air's heaviest corruption. Burn rosewood or laurel near the lintels. Bathe only when the sun is at its height. This fear shaped daily rituals: when to leave home, when to clean, even when to eat or bathe. The belief wasn't irrational. It was rooted in centuries of careful observation. People didn't notice that disease seemed worse in cities with open sewers, low-lying, swampy areas, warm, humid climates. They were correct to suspect the environment. They were just wrong about why. If foul air caused disease, then sweet smells must protect you. This logic led to the development of personal olfactory defenses. Pomanders, small, perforated orbs filled with herbs, spices, and resins worn around the neck or carried in the hand. Nosegays, bundles of aromatic flowers held near the face, especially during funerals or when walking through crowded areas. Burn herbs, including rosemary, sage, myrrh, frankincense, and juniper berries. In plague times, entire streets were perfumed with burning cedar or pine. Candles scented with cinnamon or clove were placed in windows. Doctors and priests were often seen with scented cloths pressed to their noses. It was not comfort. It was defense. Miasma theory didn't just change behavior. It changed how people built the world. Windows were made small, recessed, and difficult to open. Tightly packed city streets were seen as dangerous, not just because of crowds, but because they trapped air. Wells were placed far from waste pits, not for water purity, but to avoid rising vapors. Privies and cesspits were ventilated with vertical shafts or charcoal filters. Entire cemeteries were moved outside city walls, not because of decay, but because it was believed their air poisoned nearby neighborhoods. Even homes were judged by their scent. To have a house that smelled clean was more than etiquette. It was proof you were protected. City governments invested enormous effort into managing public smells. In 17th century London, night soil collectors gathered human waste by moonlight, carting it outside city limits. Cesspool cleaners were employed by parishes to remove rot from beneath streets. Herbal sprays were commissioned for plague years, sprayed along alleys and around hospitals. In Paris, workers called fumistes walked the streets with portable braziers, burning herbs in the alleys of poor districts. Still, the rich were not safe. Palaces were filled with perfume, not just for luxury, but to mask the dangers of fresh air that might sneak into the tapestries. One of the most iconic images of plague history, the plague doctor's beak mask, was itself a product of miasma theory. As you saw in Story 1, the beak was stuffed with herbs, not just to mask the stench of decay, but to purify incoming air. The mask's long shape gave the scent more time to cleanse the air before inhalation. Doctors sometimes changed the herbs daily, switching between lavender, cloves, mint, camphor, wormwood. It was a primitive air filter, a misunderstood but sincere attempt at survival. Despite best efforts, people still fell ill. And when they did, the air was blamed again. Doctors would often inspect a sick person's windows, chimney vents, and household odors before even examining their body. In some cases, entire buildings were ordered to be sealed and burned, not because of infection, but because of persistent bad air. In Florence, one 15th century magistrate noted, "This house hath taken in the stench of the dying. It must be emptied of all breath." And so homes became tombs, not for lack of care, but because the air was feared more than the illness. What if your greatest threat could not be seen, touched, or escaped? If the very thing that gives you life, breath, was also your enemy? You walked the closed streets of miasma-haunted cities, where open windows were sealed tight, and every waft of night air was suspect. In this section, we descend even deeper into the policies, superstitions, and institutional practices that reinforce the belief that fresh air could be fatal. From royal courts to slums, from plague carts to palace corridors, the idea of dangerous air-shaped urban life, government action, and even the design of death itself. Let us now explore a world where scent was not luxury, but defense against annihilation. In Renaissance courts and upper-class homes, aromatic control was a mark of both power and health. Noble families invested in perfumed gloves, often soaked in clove oil or ambergris, scented handkerchiefs, held constantly near the face, wall hangings made from herb-stuffed fabric, known as sachets, silver pomanders, suspended from chains and filled with musk, rose petals, or frankincense. These items were not just symbols of wealth. They were invisible armor. The logic was simple. If foul air causes illness, then sweet air must preserve life. In the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I was known to bathe rarely, but she reportedly carried bouquets and pomanders in all public appearances, especially during outbreaks of the sweating sickness. To be surrounded by scent was to ward off the invisible threat. Urban governments took miasma seriously, especially in times of epidemic. In 17th and 18th century cities like Amsterdam, Naples, and London, authorities deployed workers not to cure the sick, but to manage the smell of public life. They included scavengers, who removed rotting animal carcasses, spoiled food, and human waste; lime spreaders, who doused streets and burial pits in chalky powder to neutralize odor; herb burners, who moved through alleys with iron pots filled with pine, rosemary, or sulfur; nightmen, who hauled waste in seal wagons, often at great personal risk. Cities did not believe in contagion through contact. They believed in air that carried decay, and thus everything decaying had to be removed or disguised. While modern science teaches us to open windows and allow circulation, early public health officials believed enclosed spaces were safer, if properly scented. One common strategy: controlled smoke. Churches burned incense constantly, especially near altars or entrances. Homes used herbal smudge sticks, burned daily during epidemics. Hospitals lit tar pots or vinegar braziers at ward entrances. Schools sprayed citrus mist or hung citrus peel from ceiling beams. Smoke was not just symbolic. It was a cleansing force, believed to stabilize air and anchor the floating corruption that brought illness. In one Venetian quarantine record from 1630, a physician advised, "When the air is heavy, make it heavier still with smoke of olive and pine." In other words, fight poison with thicker poison. The obsession with clean indoor air led to new behaviors. Bedding was aired indoors, but rarely in sunlight. Windows were caulked or bricked over, especially on ground floors. Curtains were soaked in rose water. Indoor fountains were thought to moisten and purify stale air. Ironically, in their effort to avoid illness, people created stagnant, bacteria-filled indoor environments, which, in modern hindsight, likely worsened respiratory infections. But to them, a sealed, perfumed home was a fortress. The outside world was unclean. Even nature itself, especially in the form of marshes, night fog, or swamp mist, was feared. To breathe unfiltered air was to invite death into your lungs. Governments and monarchs also used miasma as a political tool. Entire neighborhoods were demolished if they were believed to emit bad vapors. Markets and fairs were banned during heavy air seasons. Travel restrictions were enforced not based on illness, but on atmospheric suspicion. During the plague of Marseille in 1720, some sections of the city were walled off not because of confirmed cases, but because the air that was deemed too thick and scented of rot. In Naples, fishermen were prevented from docking at certain times of day because officials believed sea breezes carried marsh gas inland, infecting the city. Fresh air had become a criminal suspect. While the wealthy could afford to perfume their homes and bribe inspectors, the poor lived with the smell and with the blame. Authorities often declared that slums were natural breeding grounds for disease. that certain occupations, tanners, butchers, fishmongers, were especially dangerous, that bad air lingered longer over crowded tenements. Some cities required poor households to post scented garlands on their doors to prove cleanliness. Others fined people who were reported as smelling unwell. And when outbreaks happened, poor neighborhoods were often sealed first, even before illness had been confirmed. Fresh air might be feared, but poverty that produced stench was persecuted. By the mid-1800s, science began to crack the theory. In 1846, Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that hand-washing reduced childbed fever, but was ignored. In 1854, John Snow identified a cholera outbreak linked to water, not air, an idea met with skepticism. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur began proving the existence of microbes, and yet miasma theory persisted. Even as bacteria were discovered, people still burned herbs, wore masks scented with menthol, and sealed windows at dusk. Old habits die slowly, and fear, once institutionalized, becomes architecture, policy, and tradition. Even today, echoes remain. We associate illness with musty or bad smells. We light candles or incense in hospitals and homes during illness. We open windows not just for air, but for the feeling of cleansing. We feel suspicion when a room feels thick or stale. The fear that air can betray us is deeply embedded, because for centuries we fought an invisible enemy, and we gave it a name: stench. What if the poison we feared in the air was never there at all? And what if, in closing our windows to survive, we also closed our minds? You've walked to tightly sealed homes, breathed through spice cloths, and avoided the breeze like a curse. Now, in this final section, we look at the unraveling of miasma theory. Not in a single moment, but across decades of confusion, resistance, and slow enlightenment. We'll explore how the transition from bad smells to bad microbes redefined medicine, public health, and even our relationship with air itself. Because when fear is baked into culture, science alone cannot undo it. It must be breathed out slowly. The year is 1854. London is choking, not just on fog, but on something deadlier. Cholera has struck the city for the third time in a generation. People drop where they stand. Water turns to poison. Fear thickens the alleys. Doctors are certain it is airborne, a miasma rising from the Thames, seeping from cesspools, soaking the walls. But one man, Dr. John Snow, suspects otherwise. He maps the outbreaks and traces them to a single water pump on Broad Street. He removes the handle. The cases plummet. It is one of the first great victories of epidemiology, but at the time, it's dismissed by most physicians. His theory, that disease could be transmitted through invisible particles in water, sounds absurd to believers in bad air. The truth has arrived, but belief lingers like incense. Even as the 19th century progressed, and even after the germ theory of disease gained traction, many institutions refused to let go of miasma. Sanitation boards continued focusing on odor control. Hospitals were still evaluated by their smell. Personal hygiene was prioritized to prevent air corruption. In 1865, French chemists proved that microorganisms could travel through fluids, not air. In 1876, Robert Koch isolated the bacillus for anthrax, showing disease came from living organisms. Still, schools taught miasma theory well into the 1880s. Why? Because scent was observable. Microbes were not. Fear loves what it can see or smell. Even as miasma theory faded, its rituals remained. Hospitals continued to burn antiseptic herbs like eucalyptus and lavender. Disinfectant sprays were scented intentionally. Clean had to smell clean. Death care still emphasized perfuming the body before burial. In the 20th century, companies marketed cleaning products not just for their germ-killing ability, but for their aroma. To this day, the smell of bleach, citrus, or pine comforts us, even if it has little to do with actual cleanliness. The ghost of miasma lives in our noses. Once germ theory took hold, and the air was no longer the enemy, architecture changed dramatically. Windows became larger and easier to open. Hospitals incorporated courtyards, breezeways, and natural light. Airflow was embraced, not feared. Urban design shifted. Sewers were built underground, not to remove bad air, but to protect water sources. Waste was treated before being discharged. Ventilation became a medical recommendation. The very idea of fresh air was rehabilitated. Now it was prescribed. Ironically, the thing once feared as poison became part of the cure. Today, we speak of airborne illnesses, but with precision, we understand aerosolized droplets, viral particles, HEPA filtration, air exchange rates. But in moments of crisis, like the 1918 flu or COVID-19, ancient instincts return. We open windows and panic. We spray disinfectants with more emotion than logic. We fear the cough of a stranger more than the surface of a door. And once again, we lean on scent as comfort. Because even now, a room that smells off can feel like a threat. Though wrong in theory, miasma produced. Urban sanitation movements. The removal of open sewage. An emphasis on air circulation. The understanding that environment matters in disease. In misunderstanding disease, societies often built the infrastructure that would one day prevent it. It was not ignorance. It was a prelude to clarity. There's still something sacred about air. We burn candles to remember the dead. We carry flowers to hospitals. We purify rooms with scent, smoke, or silence. We judge spaces by how they smell before we notice how they look. We no longer fear the breeze. But we never forgot what it once meant. When the air clears, what do we do with all the rituals we created to survive it? Do we let them go, or do we carry them forward just in case the wind changes again? Imagine waking one morning to find your city's gates closed, sealed by order of the magistrates. No carts enter. No messengers leave. Food prices spike. Letters are burned unopened. You are not at war. You are at risk. The enemy is not an army. It is a cough, a fever, a swelling. This is the world of the cordon sanitaire, the sanitary cordon. A boundary line not marked by flags or stone, but by fear. A line that made it inside the danger zone. And once drawn, it was rarely erased until the dying stopped. The concept of a cordon sanitaire began in 15th century Italy and France, where plague outbreaks forced cities to make impossible decisions. Let people flee and spread the disease, or trap everyone inside and try to survive together. It was a brutal compromise. Cities surrounded by military guards, who had orders to shoot anyone trying to escape. Perimeter zones patrolled day and night. Legal quarantine duration set at 40 days, 60 days, or longer. Entire towns classified as suspended, cut off from trade, communication, and support. These cordons weren't theoretical. They were enforced with steel. And behind the lines, life began to unravel. One of the most infamous examples occurred in Marseille during the Great Plague of 1720. When the disease arrived aboard the merchant ship Grand Saint Antoine, local officials delayed quarantine, eager to protect the economy. By the time they reacted, it was too late. In desperation, the city was cordoned. Walls and checkpoints were built overnight. Armed soldiers stationed every few hundred meters. Orders to kill escapees on sight. Inside the walls, churches were repurposed into mass graves. Entire families died in sealed homes. Trade collapsed. Panic spread faster than the plague. Outside, neighboring villages refused to assist. The disease was inside. The people were already written off. This became the model for epidemic containment by isolation. The city as a sacrificial unit. A cordon sanitaire did not feel like a military blockade, at least not at first. But slowly, travel permits disappeared. Markets stopped receiving shipments. Couriers were arrested, their letters burned. Food prices doubled, then tripled. The people within were not just fighting disease. They were fighting starvation, thirst, and uncertainty. Rumors replaced facts. That plague doctors had escaped. That infected bodies were being dumped in rivers. That the guards were burning incoming aid. And sometimes the rumors were true. When trust failed, the cordon became a prison. Cordon sanitaire strategies raised immediate ethical dilemmas. Could you let a child through the gate to reach your family? Could a priest leave to bury a relative? What if a nobleman demanded escape and bribed the guards? Some cordons allowed limited exceptions. Most did not. In Provence, one village mayor was caught attempting to smuggle his son through a gate using a merchant cart. The boy was discovered and both were arrested. The mayor was removed from office. The boy was sent back into the city alone. Such decisions were not personal. They were policy. The soldiers who enforced cordons were not always enthusiastic. They were poor farmers promised temporary wages, minor officials seeking promotion, young men trying to avoid the interior of the plague zone, but they faced a bleak role. If they let someone slip through, they risked punishment or spread of the disease. If they held firm, they watched people beg, starve, or die at their feet. Some deserted. Others took bribes. A few, racked with guilt, shot themselves rather than choose who to deny next. Because the cordon was not just a wall. It was a moral choke point. The world beyond the cordon changed too. Neighboring towns were terrified. Some burned bridges that connected to infected regions, dug trenches between provinces, issued shoot-on-sight orders for refugees, lit night fires to signal to travelers, do not approach. Even family ties were cut. A letter from a farmer outside Lyon reads, I see the smoke of their chimneys still. I know my cousin is there, but I cannot help. If I go, I die. If I bring him food, they will punish me. And if I wait, he may not be alive when the wall comes down. Cordon sanitaire was not a line on a map. It was a tear in human connection. Sometimes the cordon was drawn after you were already inside. Merchants, travelers, pilgrims, visiting clergy, people who had no home in the city suddenly found themselves trapped. Their fate depended on luck. Some were allowed into makeshift shelters. Others slept in the streets. Many died anonymously, far from their homes, never buried with kin. In the official records, their names often don't appear. Just entries like, unknown woman, 30 to 40, found near Eastgate. Boy, possibly servant, no records. Baker from Vienne arrived 2 days before closure. And then, deceased. When a wall goes up to save a city, who decides who gets locked inside? In the previous section, you saw how cities across Europe and beyond sealed their gates during outbreaks, drawing invisible lines of protection that often became lines of doom. Now, we move within those barriers. This section tells the story of the lives lived inside cordon sanitaires, the strange routines, the quiet rebellions, the communal silence, and the moments when entire cities began to rot from the inside out, not just with disease, but with uncertainty. Because once a city is sealed, time begins to stretch. Days grow quiet, and in the absence of escape, people begin to make new rules. Once the cordon was in place, the first thing to vanish was mobility. City gates were locked. Patrols were stationed on every outbound road. In many cases, stairs to city walls were destroyed to prevent escape over ramparts. Boats on rivers were impounded or sunk. Keys to city gates were kept only by appointed officials, often chained to their belts. Even church processions and funerals were halted. The city became not just closed to the outside, but closed to itself. Districts were divided. Travel from one neighborhood to another required written permission, verified with seals or wax stamps. And if your seal was out of date or missing, you returned home or disappeared. Cordon cities had to survive on what was already within. Food stores were immediately cataloged. How much grain was in the mills? How many cattle could be slaughtered? What water sources were safe? But as fear rose, hoarding began. Bakers shuttered their ovens. Merchants stopped selling goods. The poor were the first to suffer, but soon even the wealthy ran out of imported luxuries. Price gouging followed. Invoices from 17th century Florence show. A loaf of bread that once cost 2 soldi now sold for 11. Salt, once plentiful, disappeared. Eggs were traded 1 for silver rings. Some cities attempted rationing, but enforcement was difficult. When plague officials died, their records vanished with them. And as always, those with power ate first. When official routes were closed, unofficial ones thrived. Within weeks of a cordon, secret alleyways became trading hubs. Scribes forged travel permits using old wax. Children were sent as runners, smuggling messages and goods beneath wagons and over roofs. Midwives, previously respected, became key smugglers of medicine, cloth, or even people. But black market dealings came with danger. If caught, smugglers were often publicly flogged, imprisoned, or executed. Goods could be confiscated and burned on suspicion of contagion. Some traders simply vanished, taken by disease or silenced by those who paid for discretion. Still, these illegal networks kept many families alive. When the city stopped functioning, the underground city replaced it. Not content with closing the city, officials often began quarantining neighborhoods inside the cordon. Streets were barricaded with wagons turned on their sides, nail-studded planks, guard posts lit by torches. Wooden boards were nailed over doors. Red or black crosses were painted beside infected homes. Residents were told, "Do not leave. Food will be brought. If you die, we will bury you with haste." But the system broke down quickly. Food deliveries were delayed or stopped. Guards abandoned posts. Plague doctors refused entry. Inside these inner quarantines, people became invisible. Their stories are rare. Sometimes their letters were recovered years later, slipped through cracks in walls, or found in attics. One from 1631 simply reads, "We are 7 still. No bread today. The youngest does not speak." And nothing more. Sometimes the people push back. In Palermo, 1624, as plague swept the city under cordon, citizens stormed food depots, freed the imprisoned, burned plague houses. And when soldiers tried to restore order, they were met with barricades built from furniture, barrels, and corpses. The idea of order through containment collapsed. So did the illusion that the cordon protected the city. Instead, it trapped its rage. As the population shrank, the dead began to outnumber the living. Burial within city walls was forbidden during plague years. So what happened? Bodies were stacked in cellars, covered with lime. Abandoned churches were repurposed as holding chambers. Plague pits were dug quickly, filled without ritual, often uncovered. The stench grew unbearable. Miasma theory, as explored in Story 4, returned with full force, fueling mass panic. Some began to believe the dead were poisoning the air, that their souls were unrestful, that the city itself had become cursed. Priests conducted mass exorcisms from rooftops. Bells rang not for services, but to ward off spirits. There was no room to breathe, only to wait. Time changed behind the cordon. Markets no longer rang bells. Church clocks stopped when caretakers died. Holidays were canceled. Sermons, plays, and music fell silent. People marked time by the sound of the plague cart passing, the knock at the door with a ration, the changing of the guards at the city gate. Eventually, even these rhythms broke down. The city became a place without time, without progress, without a future. Just waiting. When freedom is taken to preserve survival, and order crumbles anyway, was the wall worth building at all? The cordon sanitaire was never meant to last forever. It was a temporary wall against the wind of fate. But even when the fever passed, the city that emerged was never the same. This is the story of what happened after. When the dead were buried, the guards dismissed, and the city gates unbarred. This is about what the survivors faced and what they couldn't leave behind. The decision to lift the cordon was never easy. Too early, an infection could reignite. Too late, and famine or unrest might destroy what the disease had not. Usually it came gradually. Certain streets reopened. Trade resumed through designated checkpoints. Letters were allowed out, fumigated, pierced with vinegar-soaked pins. Clergy declared cleansing prayers had succeeded, but there were no celebrations, no parades, no bells ringing in joy. Only a city that had held its breath for too long, now exhaling with caution. When the gates opened, the survivors did not speak loudly. Many had watched their families die, stolen to survive, turned away neighbors, or simply locked their doors while others begged outside. And though no one kept a ledger of sins committed during the cordon, everyone remembered. Communal trust took years, sometimes generations, to return. In some cases, it never did. A merchant's refusal to share flour, a widow's secret escape through a bribe, a guard who looked the other way for coin. These things were not forgotten. They were spoken of in whispers, then written into family memory. Many cities created new maps after plague years, not just of streets and buildings, but of what was now missing, entire quarters wiped out, churches left hollow, families erased from civic roles, trades gone extinct. These maps were sometimes literal, used for tax records, property reassignment, rebuilding, but they were also psychological. A child no longer walked down a certain alley. A widow never reopened her front window. A neighborhood became unlucky, avoided even when safe. The city was still standing, but it was not the same place. Some cordons were physical barriers, stone walls, wooden fences, trenches. When they were dismantled, it was often done silently, at night. No ceremony, no ritual, because to celebrate the removal was to remember why it had been built. Sometimes the wood was burned. Sometimes the stones were reused in fountains or paving. Sometimes nothing was said, but the old boundary remained in memory. Older citizens would point and say, "That's where they kept us in. That was where the guard stood. That's the path we were forbidden to cross." Lines once drawn in fear were not easily erased. When the cordon ended, not everyone returned. Traders whose families died moved elsewhere. Clergy who left never came back. Some children were sent away for safety and never reclaimed. Many streets gained new owners by inheritance, by theft, or by forgetting. Records were lost, names miswritten, histories unraveled. In this vacuum, myths grew that ghosts walked the plague streets, that certain wells still carry corruption, that a house once sealed would never be truly clean. Property could be reclaimed, but presence could not. Officials who enforced cordons often struggled after. Mayors resigned. Physicians moved to quieter towns. Guards turned to drink, because the memory of who they had denied, who they had allowed to die, and what they had seen was not easily buried. There are surviving letters, and signed, from post-cordon administrators. They were only a girl and her dog. I followed orders. I regret it still. If I had known the priest had been infected, I would not have let him pass. But he begged, and I was tired. The cordon protected the city, but it also changed everyone in it. Eventually, normalcy returned. Markets reopened. Schools resumed. Weddings were held again, though smaller, quieter. People moved back into plague houses. Children grew up with only stories of the year. The walls closed. And then came a strange kind of forgetting. Not denial, not erasure, but a smoothing of memory. The cordon became a story passed down, a line in the town's chronicle, a chapter in the priest's records. And in time, new fears took its place. Cordon sanitary strategies are still used. Ebola in West Africa, SARS in parts of China and Canada, COVID-19 lockdowns across the world. In each case, the line is drawn. Stay in. Do not cross. And each time, the same dilemmas return. Who is protected? Who is trapped? Who gets food? Who decides? We pretend it is new, but the past is still breathing through our maps and our policies. The sealed streets of plague-era Marseille and Florence are not so different from our own. They just use different ink. Today, you can visit cities that once enforced cordons. Dubrovnik, where old quarantine gates still stand. Marseille, where parts of the wall were absorbed into new buildings. Venice, where island lazarettos still sit just across the water. There are no guards, no red crosses, no plague bells. But if you stand still enough in a quiet alley, you may feel it, the echo of gates that once closed and never fully open again. What lingers longer, the disease or the fear of your neighbor? And when the wall comes down, what parts of us stay sealed behind it? The year is 1665. You are in London. Outside, the air is thick with heat, rot, and fear. Every morning, the death cart rolls through your street. The bell rings. The crier chants, "Bring out your dead," but you do not open the door. Your family has not yet fallen ill. Your windows are shut. Your hands reek of vinegar and rosemary. You are one of the lucky ones, for now. This is the story of the indoors during the Great Plague, a story of how people survived or tried to within the confines of their homes. Because sometimes the most terrifying battles happen between the walls you trust the most. At the height of the 1665 London plague, entire households were sealed inside at the first sign of illness. If one family member showed symptoms, the house was marked. A red cross was painted on the door. A sign was nailed, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen were assigned to stand guard outside, day and night. No one could leave, not for food, not for water, not even for air. You would live or die indoors. And if you were not sick when the door was shut, you might be, soon enough. Inside, windows remained sealed. As explored in Story 4, miasma theory taught that fresh air brought illness. People soaked their curtains in vinegar or rose water. Drapes were kept tightly drawn. Cracks in doors were plugged with waxcloth. This created an indoor climate of stagnant, sour air, rising humidity, the constant scent of herbs, sweat, and fear. Candles burned all day, not for light, but to cleanse the room. Fires were kept low to prevent drafts. Beds were moved away from windows. The inside was not sanctuary. It was slow suffocation. Each household made its own rituals. In one diary from the period, a merchant wrote, "We do not speak before morning prayer. My wife scrubs the corners of the kitchen floor. The girl steams cloves and sage. I read a psalm aloud. We sit apart. Others boiled vinegar in kettles for hours, washed hands repeatedly in herbal water, stared through keyholes for signs of the watchmen outside. Children were told not to cry too loudly. Their voices might stir the air. Letters from quarantined homes often mention the clock. Its ticking becoming a reminder that life still moved forward, even as they could not. A key figure in this world was the plague watchman. He was not a guard in the military sense. He was often a neighbor or a hired poor man, paid to prevent escape, bring food or water left at the doorstep, report illness or death. In some cases, nail shut windows or cellar doors. Many watchmen were illiterate, poorly paid, feared and resented by the families they watched. Some were kind. Others demanded bribes to look the other way. And some simply walked off the job, leaving families to rot unseen. Without safe access to the outdoors, homes turned inward, rooms darkened, food grew scarce. Bread, if delivered, was stale and bitter. Milk, often sour before arrival. Water barrels sat warm and green. Many families began to ration speech. Silence was easier. Games faded. Music stopped. Even prayer grew quiet. When days blend and night brings only heat and breath, even the mind begins to unravel. For those not yet sick, the burden was greatest. Cooking, cleaning, tending the ill, all with no help. Listening to coughs, measuring fevers by touch. Wondering whether to open a window, just for a moment of air. One woman wrote, "My husband coughs now, but the girl still plays with her doll. I am afraid of both sounds." The well became jailers of the dying, and eventually the last to speak for them. When death came, the watchman was summoned. The body was removed, often wrapped in the family's own linens. The bed was burned or doused with vinegar and left to rot. Sometimes, entire rooms were boarded shut. In rare cases, the entire house was burned. The remaining family was left in deeper isolation, no one trusting a home that had held death. Yet still, the windows stayed closed. Still, they waited, because outside was no safer. Indoors, the plague was not silent. People heard the bells of the dead carts, screams from neighboring houses, the chant of prayers as priests walked the streets, the muffled weeping through walls. One account from Spitalfields reads, "I knew the house next was gone, for I heard nothing for 2 days. Then the dogs began scratching at their door. To survive was to become part of the listening. The doors were closed, but ears remained open. What happens to a house when it forgets what it's like to breathe? In Section 1, we entered the sealed homes of London during the Great Plague of 1665, places where illness, fear, and duty confined families to four silent walls. Now we continue the unraveling of indoor life. The The slow disintegration of daily structure, the creeping madness of confinement, and a small act of resistance that allowed some to survive, if only in memory. Because eventually, even the strongest doorframe begins to groan under the weight of waiting. Early in quarantine, families tried to contain the illness to one part of the house. The sick were confined to upstairs bedrooms, with windows sealed by wax cloth. Bedding was burned or steeped in vinegar baths. Meals were delivered on trays, left at thresholds, collected only after the door closed again. But plague was rarely so orderly. Coughs echoed through floorboards. Fevered breath seeped beneath closed doors. Chamber pots overflowed and could not be emptied safely. Within days, boundaries within the home collapsed. Soon, the parlor became the sick room. The sick room became the death room. And the home became a single, haunted space. With no access to the outside, families turned inward into memory, routine, and ritual. Some recited the same psalm every morning for comfort, sang childhood songs quietly during mealtimes, retold stories of better days, when the river froze, when the king rode through town. These were not distractions. They were anchors. One journal reads, "My boy asks again about the apple tree at his aunt's farm. I have told him the story twice this week. I will tell it again." Because in confinement, memory becomes a way of walking, even when your feet never move. Some homes created rituals to preserve a sense of movement. Children marched in place across hallways. Meals were shifted between rooms to simulate dining out. Windows were opened ceremonially, even if only an inch, then shut again with reverence. One family used chalk to mark time, drawing a sun on the wall each morning, erasing at dusk. Another built a small altar from a chair and candlestick, holding brief services for the family cat when it died. When the outside world disappears, the human mind rebuilds in miniature. Not all homes were quiet. Families quarreled over ration food. Children grew restless and reckless. Caretakers collapsed under exhaustion. One woman wrote, "I slapped my sister today. She spilled the oil. I did not speak to her after, and now she coughs. I pray she lives. I pray she forgets." The stress of confinement brought out not just survival, but regret. No one trained for this. No one knew how to behave. And when illness arrived, blame had nowhere else to go. With no contact with the world, meaning shifted to things inside the house. A worn teacup became a prayer vessel. A cracked spoon, an heirloom of hope. A doll, the last audience to a child's speech. Every object gained weight. The Bible, bookmarked with trembling hands. The last piece of soap, its scent growing fainter by the day. The bed, too familiar with dying. There are stories of survivors keeping these objects for decades, never cleaning them fully, never discarding them, unable to explain why. Because when everything else was lost, these were the witnesses. Over time, the body became a source of paranoia. A sore throat triggered fear. A single sweat during sleep meant terror. A bruise from leaning too long on the wall was mistaken for a plague mark. People stopped speaking of illness aloud. Some pretended to feel fine until collapse. One boy is said to have played ball with his brother all morning, then lay in bed and did not rise again. The effort to hide symptoms, out of fear of being locked down further or abandoned altogether, killed many silently, because in a world of stillness, even a cough echoed like a verdict. Even without leaving the house, the world found its way in, the clang of the plague cart's bell, the low groan of a distant mourner, the creak of a watchman's boot pacing below the window. Some homes counted time by these sounds. One woman marked every death cart with a stroke of charcoal on the fireplace. She stopped at 41. The hearth was her calendar. The dead were the days. The nose told the truth. No one wanted to speak. The scent of infected sweat. The metallic tang of fevered breath. The vinegar-soaked cloths, no longer masking anything. And finally, the stillness, that eerie, scentless quiet when a body stopped exhaling. In some homes, the change in smell came before the change in voice. And when the air grew too still, the watchman was summoned. Many confined families wrote letters they knew would never be delivered, to siblings in the countryside, to lovers lost in other cities, to parents already gone. These letters were left in drawers, under mattresses, or stuffed behind bricks. One reads, "I do not know if you live, but I do for now. The sun was white today. I try to smile at the cat, but he does not smile back." Another, "If they open this house, tell them we tried. Tell them we waited. Tell them the window was never opened. When the world fits inside your walls, what pieces of yourself do you leave behind in each room, and which ones never leave? You've lived through the coughs, the prayers, the counting of death bells. The door is still closed, but now there is no watchman. The street outside is quiet. The plague has passed. The cart does not come. There are no new crosses painted. One day, someone lifts the latch, and for the first time in months or longer, the window opens. This is not a return to normal. This is a new kind of life, and it begins with learning how to step outside again. Not everyone died. Not every house became a tomb. Across London, in the months after the worst had passed, some homes reopened. Children emerged, squinting at the light. Men returned to empty workshops. Women washed linen in silence, unsure which garment belonged to the living. Inside those homes, candles had melted down to stumps. Drawers were filled with letters and makeshift wills. Bibles were warped by steam, sweat, and grief. Some families had kept meticulous journals. Others left nothing but scratched symbols on the walls. But those who remained walked out into streets filled with absence. For every home that reopened, another remained closed. Doors still sealed from the outside. Windows dusted over, curtains unmoved, gardens overgrown. Neighbors spoke in low tones. No one left that house. She buried her children in the yard. He opened the window. That's what did it. The dead were not always buried elsewhere. Sometimes they remained inside until someone had the strength or the duty to enter, and many did not look back once they had. Homes that had been quarantined bore visible scars. Red crosses, faded but not gone. Boards torn from doors, leaving marks like claw wounds. Rooms still sealed, never re-entered. One man in Clerkenwell bricked off an entire wing of his house, too full of memory to clean. Another family kept the plague bed intact, untouched, covered by a black cloth. No one slept in that room again. Even decades later, visitors would notice strange habits. Entire households with only one chair used. Windows that never opened, even in spring. Bibles always placed face down. The house may have opened, but something inside had stayed shut. Survivors did not always talk about what happened. Some spoke only the day the window opened, not the weeks before. Others created new rituals, lighting a candle each year on the date of sealing, keeping a small cloth soaked in vinegar in a box as a keepsake, naming a child after the one lost behind the door. But most said little, not because they forgot, but because they remembered too well. In time, historians would study these homes. They'd find letters folded and tucked into rafters, notches carved into beams, each a death or a prayer, small toys left in cellars, dried herbs hung in place of wallpaper. One house had every door marked with chalk symbols, a line for each day passed, a cross for each illness, a flower for each recovery. The symbols ended abruptly, and then a single word, open. When the city reopened, some never came back. Watchmen disappeared, their roles made obsolete. Priests moved on to other parishes. Survivors fled the memories attached to bricks and beams. Some houses were bought and sold without mention of what happened inside. Others were passed down, stories told only in half-truths. In time, the street healed. But in every home once marked, something lingered. And sometimes, on warm nights, a breeze through the window brought not relief, but a memory. The experience of indoor life during the plague changed how people lived. Even years later, curtains were chosen for thickness. Pantries were stocked deeper. Books were kept by the bed for long nights of waiting. And windows? They were now symbols. To some, salvation, the first view of a world they thought they'd never see again. To others, treachery, the crack through which death might have come. And to most, a reminder that they had once lived without the world, and somehow outlived it. When a house is quiet again, when all has been swept, buried, and catalogued, what is left? Not always gratitude, sometimes guilt, sometimes numbness, but often a kind of peace, because to have opened the window means you endured what you were not prepared for. You buried what you could not save. You remembered what no one else will ever fully know. When a home becomes a history, its walls silent witnesses to survival, do we ever truly leave it behind? Or does some part of us remain inside by the shuttered window, waiting for the world to knock again? You have seen the smoke of burning herbs. You have seen doors painted with red crosses and windows sealed with wax and fear. Now imagine another world, one where people gather, quietly or in secret, not around a physician, but a statue, a painting, a piece of cloth believed to have touched a saint's bones. In this world, the only protection some trusted was not vinegar or fire or masks. It was holiness, and sometimes the divine wore linen. Throughout Europe, especially between the 14th and 18th centuries, plagues were not seen as mere diseases. They were punishments, tests, or omens sent from God. If sickness came from heaven, then no earthly cure would suffice. People turned to mass prayer vigils, even as infection spread through the crowd. Self-flagellation, believing pain would purge their sins. Pilgrimage to holy sites, despite the risk of exposure. And when bodies piled too high for burial, many blamed not poor sanitation or trade routes, but spiritual impurity. In this worldview, the soul must be cleansed if the body would be saved. In times of plague, certain saints rose to prominence, not because they had been doctors in life, but because they had suffered and survived affliction or performed miracles during outbreaks. Among the most revered were a Roman soldier martyred by arrows. In medieval imagery, arrows came to symbolize the plague itself. Praying to Sebastian was thought to redirect the arrows away from your city. Statues of him, bound, pierced, and serene, stood in plague wards across Italy, said to have survived the plague, cared for the sick, and been healed by a dog who licked his wounds, often depicted showing a black plague bubo on his leg. Entire churches were dedicated to him, especially in southern France and northern Italy. A hermit from Palermo whose bones were believed to have saved the city in 1624. Her skull and vertebrae were paraded through the streets during outbreaks. These saints were not abstract icons. They were actively invoked, touched, worn, and wept over. Perhaps the most striking form of devotion was the relic cloth. These were pieces of fabric that had touched the saint's remains, covered a holy painting, been worn by a bishop during plague processions, or were cut from garments believed to have healing properties. Families kept them folded in tiny reliquary boxes or sewn into clothes. Some wore them under their tunics. Others placed them beneath pillows of the sick. There are records of entire towns cutting a saint's cloak into hundreds of ribbons, church officials dipping cloth into sacred oils, then selling or gifting it to plague houses, prisoners requesting holy cloths be placed on their eyes before execution. These weren't just symbols. They were believed to be spiritual armor. Two relics held unique status across Europe, claimed by several cathedrals, each with a piece of Mary's cloak. During plague years, the cloth was draped over city gates to shield them. In Chartres, France, it was said the relic had saved the town during invasions and pestilence alike, allegedly used by a woman named Veronica to wipe the face of Christ. Some believe it absorbed divine power and thus could neutralize pestilence. Copies of the veil were displayed in Rome and carried in processions during outbreaks. To modern eyes, these may seem like superstition, but in an age where medicine failed repeatedly, the power of belief became its own kind of cure. During outbreaks, entire cities participated in processions featuring holy linens carried on poles, statues of plague saints robed in silk or gold, candles soaked in rose water held in trembling hands. These processions were paradoxical, meant to ward off disease, but often spreading it further through crowding and contact. Still, they offered structure, comfort, and the sense that someone or something was watching over them. Not everyone believed in the power of relics. Some physicians, particularly in the late 17th century, warned against the gathering of crowds for religious events, the handling of shared cloths, the idea that plague could be stopped by paintings and pins. Even some church leaders grew skeptical, especially during repeat outbreaks where miracles failed to materialize. In some regions, laws were passed forbidding sale of plague cures without approval, public processions during high mortality periods, unauthorized distribution of sacred fabric. But belief persisted, even when forbidden, especially among the poor who could not afford a doctor but could still whisper a prayer. When all rational cures fail and the body begins to slip away, what do we reach for? Something sterile or something sacred? You have seen the saints. You have read the prayers. You have watched linen touch lips, wounds, and doors. Now, let's examine what happened next, when relics became widespread, when miracles were no longer enough, and when belief itself was packaged and sold like medicine. In plague-stricken cities, demand for protection outpaced supply. Not everyone could access a revered shrine or join a sacred procession, so the market responded. Religious institutions, monasteries, cathedral chapters, and independent clerics began producing stamped holy images of plague saints, ribbons and scapulars soaked in blessed oils, tiny packets of saintly dust, sometimes scraped from tombs or relic boxes, and most prized, pieces of holy linen, real or replicated. These were sold at church steps, by traveling monks, in town squares during clean hours. Some were freely distributed to poor. Others were auctioned at high prices. One document from Rouen, 1629, lists the cost of a printed image of Saint Sebastian, 2 sous, a cloth touched his statue, 10 sous, a verified strand from his robe, 30 sous, and a gold ring. It was a theology of transaction. As plague moved across the continent, so did mobile relics. Cities under threat would borrow bones or cloth from neighboring churches, host visiting relics, parading them through infected districts, carry statues of saints on wooden litters, sometimes lined with embroidered linen or silk. In many cases, the relics never returned to their origin. Churches would claim, "The saint wishes to stay here. He has protected us. This is now his home." Others crafted copies so that multiple towns could claim the same miracle. A strange kind of holy cloning emerged. And soon, towns that once shared relics competed for prestige. As demand grew, artisans produced painted reproductions of popular saints, printed leaflets with prayers to recite during quarantine, woven badges with saintly images and Latin phrases. Salve nos, Saint Rocco, save us, Saint Roch. These were pinned to tunics, nailed to doorframes, or burned in fires meant to purify air. Some were even eaten, yes, swallowed, after being dipped in holy water. In Bavaria, a mother was recorded as grinding a cloth touched to St. Rosalia's relic into a powder, mixing it with wine, and feeding it to her daughter with a spoon. There was no irony in this, only hope. Beneath the church-sanctioned relic trade existed a network of unofficial vendors, many posing as monks, midwives, or blessed wanderers. They offered linen from a virgin's veil, bones from the foot of a disciple, hair from a martyr's beard. In most cases, these were forgeries. Linen was cut from old altar cloths. Bones were taken from cemeteries. Sacred oil was often just rose water and wax. Yet people still bought them, because belief does not require proof. It requires need. As forgery spread, the Catholic Church and some Protestant leaders began to respond. Councils issued warnings about fake relic peddlers. Bishops were instructed to verify provenance before distributing cloth. Certain processions were banned during active outbreaks, but enforcement was uneven. In Italy, officials often looked the other way, particularly if miracles were reported. In Spain, cloth that failed to cure were burned in front of cathedral as a warning. In Geneva, Calvinist leaders outright banned relic distribution, yet found their citizens smuggling them in from France. The people had decided they would choose their own saints. Sometimes belief did not help. There are records of a town in Alsace parading a statue of Saint Sebastian daily for 2 weeks, only to suffer the worst mortality of the region, a linen relic distributed in Antwerp that was later found to have spread lice from house to house, a painting of the Virgin in Naples that wept oil, until it was revealed to be deliberately altered by candle heat. In these cases, faith faltered, but only briefly, because after each failed miracle, people searched for another. Despite the risk, many still undertook journeys to shrines during outbreaks. Some traveled barefoot for weeks to Lourdes, Santiago de Compostela, Cologne's Shrine of the Three Kings. They carried plague linens on their bodies, hoping for a touch of the relic, a drop of blessed water, a place to kneel and feel seen by the divine. Not all reached their destination. Some died on the road, alone, unwelcome, unburied, but they died in pursuit of something larger than fear. For families that survived, sacred linens became generational treasures. They were sewn into wedding garments, hidden behind icons, passed through dowries with warnings, never wash it, never question it. Even when memory of the original saint faded, the cloth remained. Some are still found today, in boxes, stitched into altar cloths, mistaken for scraps. Their stories are mostly lost, but in their fibers remains a trace of a time when linen was stronger than medicine. When healing is beyond reach and the world burns, does a scrap of cloth offer comfort or control? And when we wrap ourselves in holiness, is it faith we wear or fear? You have walked the candlelit streets. You've seen St. Roch limp past the fevered. You've watched oil drip from a virgin's eyes and touched the cloth once laid on a martyr's shrine. Now, the fever has passed, but the sacred remains. And so we ask, what happens to holy objects when the crisis they were made for no longer surround them? This is a story of relics retired, rituals remembered in the long, quiet life of belief after the bell stops ringing. When the plague lifted, towns face a delicate question: what to do with the saints? Some responses: statues of plague saints were moved to side chapels, their robes stripped of gold. Processional relics were stored in vaults, dusted yearly. Plague linens were folded into parish chests with notes, used during the 1657 visitation. But often, these items remained emotionally radioactive. People spoke of them with reverence, or not at all. One record from a French parish simply reads, "The image of Sebastian was no longer carried, but not burned. It has seen too much." Across Europe, sacred linens were placed in linen cupboards wrapped in parchment, hidden under altar cloths, stitched into banners used only once a generation. In family homes, small reliquaries were passed between generations. Some were left in attics, never reopened. Others became folk medicine, tied around wrists during fever. One Austrian woman kept a linen scapular by her bed for 40 years, replacing the thread each Easter. She never spoke of where it came from, only that it had worked. By the 18th and 19th centuries, science had changed. Germ theory was gaining ground. Religious relics fell out of medical favor. Among the educated, plague saints were dismissed as medieval fantasy. Relics were viewed as psychological crutches. Holy linens were labeled superstition. In response, some churches quietly removed plague-related statues. Others rebranded them, transforming St. Roch from a plague protector to a general patron of healing. The cloths remained, but their meaning was blurred. Even as formal belief waned, stories continued that a woman who touched a ribbon of St. Rosalia's robe never lost a child, that certain wells, where holy linens were once dipped, still healed skin diseases, that fields once circled by plague processions never failed to yield grain. In isolated towns and villages, the rituals never truly ended. Only the explanations changed. One grandmother might say, "This cloth cures fever." Her granddaughter might say, "It's just tradition." But both would use it. Today, plague saints still draw pilgrims. St. Sebastian in Rome, St. Roch in Montpellier, St. Rosalia in Palermo, where her bones are still carried through the streets every September. Visitors come not just for healing, but to remember, to see the old robes, the faded linens, the processional poles, worn smooth by centuries of hands. to feel the weight of fate that once held off death, if only for a moment. In some places, plague linens were transformed into folk art, framed behind glass, embroidered with initials, displayed during harvest festivals, not funerals. Their function had changed. They no longer claimed power over disease. They became stories, tangible links to a time when faith was not an idea, but a physical object, something you could wear, hold, tear, burn, share, or leave behind. In museums and churches, plague-era relics are rarely spotlighted. They sit behind cabinets, inside heavy chests, in drawers that creak with dust and incense. Curators open them with gloves. Historians transcribe faded Latin labels. Piece of linen from a mass of St. Sebastian, used during pestilence of 1628. Most visitors pass by, but for a moment, the cloth stirs a memory, though it may not be yours. And something in the air feels heavier. The supernatural responses to plague did not disappear. They evolved. Today, we light candles in hospitals. We wear medical bracelets. We pin ribbons for awareness. We tattoo names on our skin after loss. We still carry symbols of belief and protection. The plague saints are quieter now, but perhaps they simply changed their garments. When we put away the holy cloth, fold it, forget it, archive it, does the miracle end, or does it live on in the hands that still reach for something sacred when science goes silent? It begins with a simple exchange. A baker hands you bread. You pass him a few coins. Cool, hard, familiar. But in times of plague, this moment becomes something else entirely. That metal might carry more than value. It might carry illness. And so, for centuries, people fear that the very currency that connected society, the coin, was silently spreading death. This is the story of money turned dangerous, and how the world tried to disinfect not just bodies, but economies. In the centuries before germ theory, most people believed illness could spread through objects, particularly those that passed quickly and touched many hands. Coins were seen as especially suspect. Why? They passed between strangers. They came from travelers, foreigners, and marketplaces. They were hard to clean. They smelled of sweat, grease, blood, and metal. Doctors warned against touching coins with bare hands. Priests refused alms unless wrapped in cloth. Merchants dropped money into bowls of vinegar before accepting payment. A coin was no longer just a symbol of trust. It became a carrier of fear. To reduce the risk of infection, cities and shops introduced quarantine practices for money. Wooden boxes lined with lead or zinc were used to store incoming coin. Coins were placed in these boxes for several days to let the corruption die. Some chests were lined with salt, sulfur, or herbs. Others had slatted compartments to prevent coins from touching. In Venice, port officials required all imported coinage to be washed in vinegar or urine, held in isolation for 14 days before circulation, recorded in ledger books with origin and handling instructions. This system created a strange rhythm, delayed transactions, staggered wages, and a sense that even money had to rest and recover. Merchants adapted. Tongs were used to handle coins. Ceramic or copper bowls were placed between buyer and seller. Coins were dropped in, never passed hand to hand. Wealthier shops used leather gloves to handle change. In some cities, coins were wrapped in paper, not for counting, but for shielding. One French apothecary in 1604 kept a sign, payment placed in bowl, no coin shall be touched. Another in Prague added, silver is safer than copper, gold safer still. The hierarchy of money was now matched by a hierarchy of fear. In severe outbreaks, people avoided physical transactions altogether. Instead, they sent servants or children to pay on their behalf, used marked stones to represent coinage, redeemable later, paid with goods or favors rather than coins. In one German village, a system of weighted bags was used. You brought a sack with 10 pre-counted coins. You left it at the shop's doorstep. The shopkeeper returned it 3 days later with goods inside. If you got the wrong items, you didn't complain. The priority was not accuracy. It was distance. Even churches altered their offerings. Coins were dropped into fumigated boxes, often built into stone pillars. The hand-to-hand blessing was suspended. Some priests refused to touch money at all, relying on promissory tokens or written tithes. In some regions, churchgoers would pin coins to cloth, leave them under pews, or offer grains, bread, or candles instead. The economics of faith had to adapt. God still watched, but so did the disease. As coins were quarantined or destroyed, many regions experienced shortages of small denominations, clipping and counterfeiting, especially of copper coins, a rise in credit systems, often informal, based on reputation. Markets grew tense. Buyers offered buttons or tokens in place of coins. Sellers refused to touch cash without witnesses. In plague cities like London, 1665, and Florence, 1630, coins were often burned when traced to infected homes. The idea of dirty money became literal. In later centuries, as paper money emerged in China, Sweden, and eventually France and England, it was hailed as a possible plague solution. Easier to store, lighter to disinfect. But paper had problems too. It absorbed oils and sweat. It wore down quickly, and it passed hand to hand even faster. Doctors warned. The printed note may carry more than ink. Attempts were made to seal paper money in wax, stamp it with dates, tracking its quarantine period, or, in some cases, refuse it entirely. Cash was no longer just a question of trust. It was a question of life and death. The economics of plague led to bizarre scenes. Buyers throwing coins onto cloth-covered tables, retreating quickly, sellers picking them up with sticks or blades. Prices increasing not due to supply, but to handling risk. One merchant's note reads, "The apples are priced at 5 deniers, and 2 for touching them." Even bartering returned. A loaf for a bottle, a knife for a bag of grain, a prayer for a packet of salt. Currency had failed, trust had narrowed, and survival had replaced economics. When value becomes a threat, when a coin holds more fear than wealth, what does that say about the world we built around it? The last section showed us how coins became suspect, fumigated, and sometimes burned. But the plague didn't just stain metal. It distorted entire economic systems. This is a story of hoarders and debtors, of gold untouched in dark rooms, and of the strange mathematics that plague years demanded. Because in a world where human contact was death, money lost its hands. In cities struck by plague, the wealthy withdrew early. Country estates filled with urban merchants, lawyers, and nobility. Caravans left the cities with carts of grain, wine, silver, and servants. Ledgers were closed, contracts postponed, credit frozen. Within these distant estates, small economies were rebuilt. Bakers, blacksmiths, and midwives were hired to remain inside the state walls. Visitors were turned away, even doctors. Cooks handled deliveries with tongs. Coins were boiled in wine before payment. One noble woman in Florence insisted on 6 weeks between touching any silver paid by hand. It is kept in a locked room with only smoke and prayers. The rich could afford to isolate their money. The poor could not. In plague zones, work stopped. Day laborers were dismissed. Markets shuttered or raised prices beyond reach. Those without savings were forced to sell personal items, rings, clothing, pots, offer services for food, not pay, take dangerous work, such as grave digging or corpse hauling. One record from London, 1665, lists 200 men working as body bearers, paid 2 pence per corpse. Many died before collecting payment. Others became plague beggars, marked by law as unclean, forced to wear signs or rags, and refused contact. They held out bowls from a distance, waiting for someone to toss a coin in, then waited hours before retrieving it. Even money had a waiting period. Barter returned with new, cruel nuances. Examples from plague-era Europe. A carpenter agreed to repair a sealed house in exchange for bread, not coin. A midwife demanded cloth, not money, for delivering a baby inside a quarantine zone. A baker refused to sell unless the buyer offered 2 family names, so they could be traced later. Trust was now personal and recorded. No more strangers. Only the known could buy. Death disrupted accounting. Thousands died without paying taxes, rents, or loans. Creditors couldn't enter plague homes to collect. Executors of wills fell ill before completing estates. This led to lost fortunes, abandoned property, falsified claims, people pretending a debtor had died or that a payment had been made before the fever came. One London creditor wrote, "I knocked at the door at Thomas Wren. None answered. A mark was drawn there. I left and wrote the debt as smoke." Others bribed clergy or notaries to forge final settlements. Economics unraveled under the pressure of mortality. In times of fear, value became distorted.